He paid fortunes to be bathed by women who never returned. She accepted out of necessity, and because she didn't believe in curses. And when she took off her clothes, their fate was sealed. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. In the dusty halls of Blackwood Manor, a centuries-old property hidden among the rolling hills of Virginia, lives Vincent Blackwood, 48 years old, the last heir of an Italian lineage that settled in America, carrying secrets older than the abandoned coffee plantations themselves. The manor, built in 1847 by his great-great-grandfather, breathes history in every fired clay brick, in every walnut beam that supports the high ceilings, where echoes of past generations still whisper in the early hours. Wealthy beyond common understanding, owner of a fortune built through unquestioned investments and businesses hidden behind shell companies, Vincent chose isolation as his way of life. For 20 years, he hasn't set foot in the streets of Richmond, doesn't frequent Virginia's elite clubs, doesn't appear in the social pages of local newspapers. His beauty, a genetic inheritance that time seems unable to touch, remains untouched by the 48 years he carries. Black hair without a single grey strand, dark eyes that seem to contain storms, muscles defined as if he were still 20, skin that has never known deep wrinkles. In the greenhouses of the manor, among carefully organized beds, he cultivates rare black orchids, a species that only he can make bloom in this soil. The garden around the greenhouse remains barren, as if the earth itself rejected any other form of life. The black orchids, with their velvety, midnight-colored petals, are the only beauty he can create, the only life he can sustain without destroying. For decades, Vincent has developed a ritual that keeps his sanity balanced on the tightrope between madness and resignation. Once a month for exactly 20 years, a young woman is hired under terms that would sound absurd to any normal person. She must come to the manor, walk through the flagstone corridors that his great-great-grandfather had installed, climb the walnut staircase to the second floor, enter the bathing chamber built in black marble imported from Carrara, and bathe him. Just that, nothing more. The ritual is precise, almost surgical in its simplicity. The woman must completely undress before him, unhurriedly, without shame, as if fulfilling an ancestral sacrament. She must guide him to the aged copper bathtub that occupies the center of the chamber, a piece that crossed the Atlantic with the first Blackwoods who set foot on American soil. With artisanal soap made with black orchid essence, a perfume he himself produces in small quantities, she must wash his body with slow, deliberate, almost reverent movements. When the bath ends, she dresses, receives payment in cash, always a sum generous enough to change a life, and departs without ever looking back. No woman has ever returned. No questions are asked, no answers are offered, just money and silence, an agreement sustained by absolute discretion and mutual necessity. In these 20 years, 57 women have passed through the bathing chamber of Blackwood Manor. 57 women have touched his skin, washed his hair, slid their hands over his shoulders and back, and disappeared forever from his life. Some cried during the ritual, others laughed nervously. Many remained in absolute silence, but all departed transformed in some way, carrying in their bodies the memory of an encounter they could never explain to anyone. Vincent believes, with a certainty that has corroded his soul for decades, that his touch can destroy, that his presence is capable of consuming everything good and pure in the world. This conviction wasn't born of paranoia or vanity, but of concrete experiences, of devastating losses, of deaths that he carries in his conscience like stones in his chest. Hence the ritual, hence the distance, hence the solitude cultivated as a form of protection for the outside world. The manor breathes this melancholy. The staff, few and loyal, maintain their respectful distances. Mrs. Geraldine, the 60-year-old cook who arrived at the manor when she was young and never left, prepares his meals and leaves them on trays at the office door. Mr. Joaquin, the caretaker, who knows every tree and every stone of the property, tends to the gardens and greenhouses without ever crossing paths with the master in the corridors. The house functions like a silent mechanism, where each piece knows its place and function. In the late afternoons, when the sun sets behind the hills and shadows begin to dance through the empty halls, Vincent walks through the corridors like a ghost in his own home. The portraits of his ancestors observe him from the walls, serious faces of men and women who carried the same weight that now rests upon his shoulders. The family patriarch, Joseph Blackwood, still young in the oil painting that dominates the main hall, seems to whisper ancestral secrets every time Vincent passes by. Joseph brought more than coffee and dreams of prosperity when he crossed the ocean in 1847. He also brought a dark inheritance, a pact sealed in blood on Tuscan lands, a promise that took root in American soil and blossomed like a curse spreading through generations. The Blackwood men are born marked, destined to carry the weight of choices they didn't make, prisoners of a fate they didn't choose. The next new moon is approaching. In 3 days, a new woman will cross the gates of the manor, climb the walnut staircase, and enter the bathing chamber. She will be the 58th. Vincent doesn't know her name, doesn't know her story, doesn't imagine her fears or hopes. He only knows that she will come, fulfill the ritual, and depart never to return. But this time, something will be different. This time, fate is preparing a twist that will shake the foundations of Blackwood Manor and challenge a pact that has crossed centuries. This time, the woman who will cross its gates carries in her veins the blood of a lineage he believed extinct, an inheritance that could liberate or destroy everything he knows. The story is just beginning. In the narrow streets of Riverdale, in Richmond, where houses press against each other like fingers interlaced in a desperate prayer, lives Amelia Davis, 23 years old, only daughter of a washerwoman and granddaughter of a woman who mysteriously disappeared in the 60s after being accused of practices that the neighborhood whispered was witchcraft. The house where Amelia grew up still carries the smell of bar soap and bleach, but also keeps older secrets in the cracks between the exposed bricks and in the shadows that dance in the corners when daylight bids farewell. Her face possesses a raw beauty, without artifice, shaped by the daily struggle and nights of interrupted sleep by her mother's moans of pain in the room next door. Dark brown hair that she always ties in a simple bun for work. Green eyes inherited from her disappeared grandmother. Brown skin that the Virginia sun lovingly tinted during years of walks under the open sky. Her hands, calloused from work, tell the story of a life built cent by cent, in courage and determination. Amelia works in a small shop of esoteric products in the city center, a job she found by chance, but that seems to have found in her a natural vocation. Among crystals, incense, tarot cards, and books on occultism, she discovered a world that always seemed to whisper her name. The clients, women of all ages seeking answers, comfort, or simply someone to listen to them, find in her a reassuring presence, a wisdom that seems to come from a deeper place than her young age suggests. But it's at night, when she returns home after a full day of work, that Amelia faces her true battle. Her mother, Constance, 52 years old, is fighting uterine cancer that doctors in the public health system identified too late. The endless waiting lines, exams that take months to get results, expensive medications that the government promises to provide, but that always run out at the public pharmacy. The urgent surgery that could save her life costs $40,000, a sum that might as well be $1 million for someone who earns minimum wage and a half. For weeks, Amelia tried every possible avenue. She sought financing, organized raffles, asked for help in social media groups, talked to NGOs and charitable institutions. She managed to gather only $8,000, a drop in the ocean of despair in which she finds herself. Each passing day is one day less to save the only family she has, the only person in the world who truly knows and loves her. It was on a rainy Tuesday, as she was returning from the shop with a heavy heart and aching feet, that she found the envelope under the door of her house. An envelope of thick paper, yellowed by time, sealed with red wax where one could see the drawing of an orchid. Her name was written on the front, in an old-fashioned handwriting, each letter drawn with the perfection of someone who learned to write in an era when beautiful handwriting was a sign of good education. Inside the envelope, a letter on parchment paper, written with black ink that seemed to have been applied with a quill, the words chosen carefully, each sentence constructed as if it were a verse of ancient poetry. Miss Davis, we need silence. We need courage. We need you. The text continued, explaining a proposal that sounded simultaneously absurd and tempting, a unique job, a payment of $50,000, an opportunity that would change her life forever. Amelia read the letter 3 times before she could fully process its content. Someone was willing to pay a fortune for her to perform a specific job at an isolated manor on the outskirts of the city. The job consisted of bathing a person once a month for a year. Just that. No additional explanations, no details about who would be bathed or for what reason. Just the promise of full payment on the first day of work and the warning that questions would not be tolerated. Her first reaction was distrust. In times of digital scams and false proposals circulating on the internet, offers too generous always sound like traps. But something about the paper, the handwriting, the smell of the envelope that reminded her of ancient flowers, suggested authenticity. And more than that, it suggested a connection that she couldn't explain rationally, but that she felt on her skin like recognition of something ancestral. For 3 nights, Amelia stayed awake thinking about the proposal. She talked to herself in a low voice, weighed pros and cons, tried to imagine possible scenarios. Her mother, increasingly weak, coughed in the room next door while she struggled between prudence and desperation. At the end of the 3rd night, when the first ray of sunlight crossed the bedroom window and illuminated Constance's pale face, Amelia made her decision, a virgin not by religious or moral conviction, but by a deep fear of abandonment and surrender. Amelia always kept men at a respectful distance. She experienced some kisses, some caresses exchanged hastily at house gates or dark corners of neighborhood parties, but always retreated before desire could fully bloom. Her virginity was less about purity and more about protection, a wall built brick by brick to avoid the pain she saw her mother carry after her father abandoned them when she was only 5 years old. This virginity, which always seemed a burden to her in a society that demands performative sensuality from women, now took on a different meaning in the mysterious letter. It wasn't clearly written, but there were lines that suggested her inexperience wasn't an impediment, but perhaps even a requirement for the proposed job. It was as if whoever wrote the letter knew not only her name and address, but also her intimate history, her deepest fears, her most guarded vulnerabilities. In the envelope there was also a simple business card, just with an address in the rural area of New Haven and instructions on how to reach Blackwood Manor. The date marked was for the following Saturday, noon sharp. No phone number to confirm attendance, no name for reference, no form of contact. Just the confidence that she would appear at the date and time agreed upon. Amelia kept the letter in a drawer, along with the few jewels she inherited from her disappeared grandmother. A silver ring with a green stone, antique filigree earrings, and a necklace with a crescent moon pendant. Pieces that her mother always said belonged to a time when the Davis family had other surnames and other stories. Times when the women of the lineage were respected and feared in equal measure, for knowledge not learned from books. When she finally told her mother about the proposal, omitting the stranger details, Constance looked at her with eyes that seemed to recognize something familiar in the situation. "Sometimes fate sends opportunities that seem dangerous, daughter," she said with a weak voice, but full of wisdom that transcended her debilitated physical state. "But our family has always had a special relationship with danger. Your grandmother used to say that we were born to face what other people run from." Saturday was approaching. In 2 days, Amelia would get on the bus that would take her to New Haven, cross wrought iron gates, step on lands that guard centuries-old secrets, and meet the man who needs to be bathed once a month. She didn't yet know that she was about to enter a story that began long before her birth, in a web of intertwined destinies that connects the present to the past in ways she could never imagine. The bus to New Haven cut through the Virginia landscape at a speed that seemed to awaken the hills slumbering under the midday sun. Amelia occupied a window seat, observing how the big city gradually gave way to small towns, then to villages, until there remained only dirt roads, winding between abandoned plantations and colonial houses that resisted time like scars on the landscape. Her hands sweated inside the bag where she kept the letter, as if the paper emanated its own heat that warmed her fingers even through the fabric. She got off at the stop indicated in the letter, a solitary bus stop marked only by a rusted sign that announced Blackwood Manor 2 miles. The red dirt road stretched before her like a thirsty tongue, flanked by tall pines that created dancing shadows on the ground. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heart beating as she walked, her steps raising small clouds of dust that stuck to her bare legs. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton model that she bought on sale, and that always made her feel more confident. Low shoes, practical, that would withstand the walk on the dirt road. Hair loose for the first time in months, a last-minute decision that now made her question if she was adequately dressed for a situation she couldn't even fully define. The gates of Blackwood Manor appeared at the end of the road like a materialized mirage. Black wrought iron, worked in designs that resembled intertwined vines, fixed in Portuguese stone columns that rose like silent sentinels. The Blackwood family crest was engraved in the center of the gates, a black orchid surrounded by thorns, with a phrase in Latin that she couldn't translate, but that seemed charged with ancestral solemnity. The gates opened even before she approached, as if her presence was expected and observed. An elderly man dressed with simplicity, but with a dignity that suggested decades of loyal service, beckoned for her to follow the driveway that led to the main house. He didn't say a word, just walked in front of her with measured steps as if conducting a religious ceremony. The house emerged from among the centennial trees like a vision out of a Baroque dream. 3 stories of American colonial architecture, mixed with Italian influences. Walls whitewashed that time had tinted a soft yellow. High windows protected by dark wooden shutters. Ornate verandas with balustrades worked in soapstone. Formal gardens extended on both sides of the building, but only the black orchids bloomed in carefully maintained beds. At the main door, a woman awaited her. Amelia needed a few seconds to fully process what she saw. Hair white as snow fixed in a severe bun, wrinkled but still dignified skin, black dress that seemed to have come from another century, and eyes. Eyes completely white, vitreous like polished marble. The woman was blind, but the way she stared at her when she approached suggested that she saw far beyond what normal eyes can capture. "Miss Davis," said the woman with a hoarse but firm voice, making her name sound like an ancient prophecy. "I am Bernadette, caretaker of this house for 40 years. Come, we don't have time to lose." Her words came out paused as if each syllable was weighed before being pronounced. Amelia noticed that the woman didn't move her lips in the common way when she spoke, as if her voice emerged from somewhere deeper than the throat. The interior of the house took her breath away. High ceiling decorated with frescoes depicting American rural scenes, mixed with European mythological motifs. Portuguese stone floors forming complex geometric designs, period furniture that seemed to have crossed oceans and centuries to occupy their precise places. The smell was of old wood, beeswax, and something more indefinable. Something floral and at the same time earthy that reminded her of well-maintained cemeteries. Bernadette led her through corridors lined with family portraits, men and women from different eras, but with the same expression in their dark eyes, as if they shared a secret too heavy to be revealed. Amelia tried to memorize the faces, looking for similarities, clues that would help her understand what she was getting into. All the men possessed the same dark beauty, the same intensity in the gaze, the same aura of contained power. "The contract," said Bernadette, stopping in front of a walnut table where ancient papers were organized with military precision. "Read in silence. Sign if you agree. Refuse if your courage is not sufficient." The way she pronounced the word courage sent a shiver down Amelia's spine, as if the woman could see directly into her soul and measure her strength. The contract was written in the same handwriting as the letter, in archaic English that required concentration to be fully understood. The terms were clear and at the same time obscure. She committed to appearing once a month for a year, performing a personal hygiene service, according to instructions that would be given at the appropriate time, maintaining absolute secrecy about everything she saw or heard on the property. In exchange, she would receive $50,000 at the end of the first day of work. But there were strange clauses. She could not ask questions about the nature of the work, about the identity of the person who would be bathed, about any aspect of the family or the property. She could not bring personal objects beyond simple clothes. She could not tell anyone, not even family, details about her experience. And a clause that made her hesitate. The contractor understands that she is entering a situation that can permanently alter her perception of reality and accepts all physical, emotional, and spiritual consequences of this commitment. Amelia thought about her mother lying in bed, increasingly thin, each day closer to an irreversible decision. She thought about the $8,000 she had managed to gather, insufficient to save a life. She thought about all the doors that had closed, about all the frustrated hopes. She signed her name with a steady hand, sealing an agreement that she felt was much bigger than a simple work contract. "Now come," said Bernadette, putting away the papers in a locked drawer. "He is waiting." The word "he" was pronounced with a reverence that made Amelia understand that she was about to meet someone important, not only to this house, but to her own existence in ways she couldn't yet imagine. They climbed the walnut staircase, each step creaking softly under her feet, as if announcing her arrival. On the second floor, Bernadette stopped in front of a double door of dark wood ornamented with bas-reliefs of intertwined orchids. "Remove your clothes here," she said, handing her an ancient ceramic basin and a soap that exhaled the most intense and seductive perfume that Amelia had ever smelled. "Enter only when you are ready. He will not speak to you. You must not speak to him. Just fulfill the ritual." Amelia's hands trembled as she unbuttoned her dress. It wasn't common modesty, but a sensation that each piece of clothing she removed brought her closer to a destiny that had been traced long before her birth. When she was completely naked, holding only the basin and the soap, she felt that her previous life had remained on the floor along with her clothes. She pushed the heavy doors and entered the most impressive bathing chamber she could imagine. Black marble on the walls, decorated with golden veins that seemed to pulse with their own light. Thick candles arranged in silver candlesticks that created a golden, dancing illumination. In the center of the room, the aged copper bathtub, large as a small pool, already filled with steaming water that exhaled aromatic vapors. And in the bathtub, motionless as a Renaissance statue, was the most beautiful man she had ever seen in her life. Vincent Blackwood had his eyes closed, wet black hair stuck to his skull, defined muscles visible through the clear water, tanned skin that seemed to have been sculpted by a divine artist. When she entered, he slowly opened his eyes and stared at her with an intensity that made her feel that she was being seen for the first time in her life. Time seemed suspended in that black marble chamber, where only the sound of water bubbling in the bathtub and the controlled breathing of two strangers broke the charged silence. Amelia remained motionless for long seconds at the entrance of the room, feeling that she had crossed an invisible border between the common world and something ancestral, primitive that pulsed in the century-old walls around her. The nudity, which she imagined would be the most challenging aspect of that encounter, revealed itself to be secondary to the intensity of the gaze that pierced through her. Vincent didn't avert his eyes when she entered. On the contrary, his observation was so intense, so devoid of common malice, and at the same time so charged with something indefinable that Amelia felt as if she was being read in layers that not even she knew. It wasn't vulgar masculine desire that she saw in those dark eyes, but recognition, as if he was meeting someone he had been waiting for decades, without knowing exactly who he was waiting for. She took the first step toward the bathtub, then another, each movement deliberate and careful. Her bare feet on the cold marble created a contrast with the hot steam that rose from the aromatic water. The soap in her hands exhaled that unique perfume, floral and earthy, that seemed to activate memories she didn't know she possessed. When she reached the edge of the bathtub, she could perfectly see the male body submerged, the tanned skin, the defined muscles, the breathing that became deeper with each second. "May I touch you?" she asked in a low voice, almost whispering, momentarily forgetting the instruction to remain silent. The question came out naturally, instinctively, as if her body understood that she was about to cross a sacred barrier that required mutual consent. Vincent didn't respond verbally, but inclined his head in an almost imperceptible form of assent, a movement that carried decades of solitude and repressed need. Amelia immersed her hands in the warm water and, for the first time in 20 years, touched Vincent Blackwood's skin. The effect was instantaneous and devastating for both. She felt an electric shock rise through her arms, a current of energy that made every nerve ending in her body awaken simultaneously. He closed his eyes tightly, as if receiving a stab of pleasure and pain mixed, a hoarse moan escaping from his parted lips. The water in the bathtub began to tremble slightly, small ripples that seemed to emanate from the point where her hands touched his masculine shoulders. Amelia noticed the strange phenomenon, but wasn't frightened. On the contrary, she felt strangely familiar with that reaction, as if her touch had always produced effects that others didn't. She applied the soap to her palms and began to lather his broad shoulders, sliding her hands over the tense muscles with circular, slow, almost meditative movements. Vincent kept his fists clenched on the edges of the bathtub, his knuckles white from the pressure he exerted on the metal. It was as if he was fighting against something much bigger than physical desire, an internal battle between need and self-preservation. Each touch of the feminine hands awakened sensations that he had buried for so long that he already believed them dead. But it wasn't just physical pleasure that he felt, it was recognition, completeness, as if a lost part of himself was being returned through those hands, calloused by work. Amelia moved with a natural grace that surprised them both. Her hands slid over his chest, over his defined arms, over his neck where she could feel the accelerated pulse beneath the skin. There was no hurry in her movements, no sexual urgency, but a reverence that transformed the bath into a sacred ritual. It was as if she instinctively knew where to touch, how long to remain in each region of the body that she washed with almost religious dedication. The steam from the water created an unreal atmosphere around them, enveloping their bodies in a golden mist that filtered the candlelight. The shadows danced on the marble walls, creating patterns that seemed to tell ancient stories, secrets kept for generations. The perfume of the soap intensified with the heat, filling the environment with a fragrance that awakened something primitive, ancestral, as if activating genetic memories engraved in the DNA of both. When her hands descended to wash his chest, her fingers accidentally brushed a thin scar that transversely cut the left side of his torso, right over the heart. Vincent instantly opened his eyes, fixing her with an intensity that made her stop for a moment. The scar was old but still perceptible, a mark that told a story that she intuited was fundamental to understanding the man before her. "You were wounded," she murmured, more to herself than to him, delicately tracing the line of the scar with the tip of her index finger. Vincent shuddered under the touch, not from pain, but from an emotion that he hadn't visited for decades. None of the previous 57 women had noticed the scar, or if they noticed, they hadn't shown any interest. But Amelia touched the old mark, as if she understood that engraved there was a pain that transcended the physical. She continued the bath in reverent silence, washing the long arms. The hands that she noticed were large and strong, but which trembled slightly under her touch. When she silently asked him to lean forward to wash his back, she could see other smaller scars, some so old that they seemed to be part of the landscape of his masculine skin. Each mark told a story of violence, struggle, survival, and she found herself wanting to know all these stories. The broad back was an extension of muscles defined by manual work and time, tanned skin that suggested hours under the sun, cultivating the black orchids she had seen in the gardens. Her hands slid over the extension of his back with a familiarity that surprised her, as if she had already touched that body in dreams she didn't remember having. Vincent curved slightly under her caresses, a gesture of voluntary submission that contrasted with the aura of power that emanated from him. When the bath came to an end, both remained motionless for long moments, she standing beside the bathtub, he still submerged in the water that was beginning to cool. The silence between them was charged with everything that couldn't be said, with questions that couldn't be asked, with mutual recognition that transcended words. It was as if they had participated in an ancestral ceremony whose complete meaning only their souls understood. Vincent exited the bathtub with slow movements, the water running down his naked body, without him showing any embarrassment. Amelia extended to him a large towel of Egyptian cotton that she found on a nearby shelf. But when their fingers briefly touched during the transfer of the fabric, both felt again that electric current that seemed to connect them in ways that defied rational explanation. He dressed in silence, dark pants and white shirt that accentuated his dark beauty, while she remained naked, holding the damp towel like a symbolic shield. When he finished dressing, Vincent approached her for the first time since she had entered the chamber. He stood so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the smell of his clean skin, the intensity of his controlled breathing. Without saying a word, he extended a thick envelope that he took from his pants pocket. Amelia took it with hands that still trembled slightly, feeling the weight of the money inside the paper. $50,000 as promised, money enough to save her mother's life, to completely change her financial reality, to open doors that had always been closed. But when their gazes met for the last time before she turned to leave, both knew that something much more valuable than money had been exchanged in that black marble chamber. A connection had been established, a mutual recognition had happened, and both intuited that their lives would never be the same after that first intimate and transformative encounter. The journey back to Richmond passed in a state of conscious sleepwalking, as if Amelia had left a part of herself in the black marble chamber of Blackwood Manor. Sitting in the same window seat on the bus, she watched the rural landscape give way again to the suburbs of the capital, but everything seemed different, as if she saw the world through lenses that had been polished by a transformative experience. The envelope with the money remained stuck to her sweaty hands, tangible proof that it hadn't just been an intense dream. Her hands still retained the scent of the black orchid soap, a perfume that seemed to have permanently penetrated her skin. Throughout the journey, she caught herself lifting her palms to her nose, inhaling that unique fragrance that awakened confused memories of dreams she didn't remember having. It was as if the perfume carried with it not just the smell of flowers, but the essence of the man she had touched, the temperature of his skin, the texture of his muscles under her exploring hands. She arrived home when the sun was already setting behind the mountains that surround Richmond, painting the sky with orange tones that reflected in the windows of the tightly packed houses of Riverdale. Her mother, Constance, was awake in bed, more alert than she had been in weeks. It was as if the proximity of the solution to her health problems had injected new energy into her body, debilitated by disease. "How was it, dear?" asked Constance with genuine curiosity, studying her daughter's face for clues about the mysterious experience. "You look different, as if you've grown several years in just one afternoon." Her weak voice carried the sharp intuition of a mother who knows every nuance of her daughter's expressions, every alteration in her behavior, every new shadow in her eyes. Amelia showed the envelope, opening it slowly to reveal the $50 bills carefully organized. The money was real, substantial, enough to pay for her mother's surgery and still have some left for subsequent treatments. Constance brought her hands to her mouth, tears springing in her tired eyes worn out by chronic pain. It was the first tangible miracle they had witnessed in years of struggle against poverty and disease. "What kind of work pays you so much money in one afternoon?" asked Constance with the natural concern of a mother who knows the dangers that lurk around young women desperate for money. "You didn't do anything that might bring you trouble later, did you?" Her question carried decades of experience living in urban peripheries, where offers too generous often hide dangerous traps. "It was just housework at a wealthy estate," answered Amelia. "Technically truthful, but omitting all the details that would make the truth impossible to believe. A traditional family that has old-fashioned ways of doing things. Nothing you need to worry about, Mum." Her words sounded convincing, but she herself wasn't completely sure that there weren't reasons for concern. That night, after helping her mother with her medications and organizing the details to schedule the surgery at the private hospital the next day, Amelia lay down in her narrow bed but couldn't sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw with perfect clarity the male body submerged in the copper bathtub, felt again the texture of his skin under her palms, heard the sound of controlled breathing that betrayed an internal struggle between desire and self-control. But more than physical memories, something had awakened inside her during that ritual bath, a sensation of power she had never experienced before, a connection with aspects of her own nature that she had kept dormant. The hands that had touched Vincent still tingled with residual energy, as if they had absorbed something from the mysterious man and could no longer return to their previous state of dormancy. During the following days, while taking care of the details of her mother's surgery and trying to return to her normal routine at the esoteric products shop, Amelia found herself researching the Blackwood family. In her work breaks, she used the shop's computer to search for information on the internet about the manor, about the Italian lineage that had established itself in Virginia in the 19th century, about any clue that could explain the singular nature of her experience. The information was scarce and contradictory. The Blackwood family appeared in sporadic historical records, always associated with considerable fortunes, but also with inexplicable tragedies. Women from the region who had mysteriously disappeared over the decades, always young, always beautiful, always in circumstances that the newspapers of the time preferred not to investigate too deeply. Strange accidents involving family members, premature deaths, social isolation that lasted generations. But it was on a Tuesday afternoon, while organizing old books on a dusty shelf in the shop, that Amelia found something that made her heart race. Among volumes on herbalism and protection rituals, a book with a worn leather cover caught her attention, not by its title, but by the surname engraved in faded golden letters on the spine, Davis, Lineages and Curses of the New World. The book seemed too old to be in a modern esoteric products shop, as if it had been placed there specifically for her to find. When she opened it, she discovered that it was written in archaic English, with detailed illustrations of medicinal plants, esoteric symbols, and, surprisingly, family genealogies that specifically mentioned the Davis lineage as ancestral guardians, with powers of healing and destruction through touch. A specific passage made her hands tremble as she read, "The daughters of the Davis lineage carry in their veins the blood of the ancient healers who crossed the ocean in slave ships, mixing African knowledge with European secrets banned by the Inquisition. When a true Davis touches those marked by ancient pacts, a force awakens that can break century-old curses or condemn souls to eternal perdition." That night, Amelia confronted her mother with the book. Constance looked at the cover with painful recognition, as if seeing a materialized ghost. "This book belonged to your grandmother Mary," she said with a voice choked by emotion. "I thought it had been lost when she disappeared. How did it reach your hands?" Her words carried decades of kept secrets, of truths that she had promised to take to the grave. "Mom, you need to tell me the truth about our family," said Amelia, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her mother's fragile hands between hers. "About Grandma, about what happened to her, about why we've always had this strange reputation in the neighborhood, about why people sometimes look at me as if they know something about me that I don't know." Constance sighed deeply, as if finally freeing herself from a weight she had carried alone for decades. "Your grandmother didn't disappear, daughter. She was taken by a wealthy family that needed to break an ancient curse, the Blackwoods." The name left her lips like a curse, loaded with pain and resentment accumulated over the years. She was the first of our lineage to be called to that manor. But something went wrong. She fell in love with the man she was supposed to just heal, and he fell in love with her. When they tried to break the pact through true love, the forces that kept the curse active turned against them. She disappeared on a stormy night, and he remained forever trapped on those lands, condemned to repeat the ritual until another Davis appeared to finish what had been started. Amelia felt the world spin around her as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in a terrifying way. "You knew," she murmured with a weak voice. "When I received the letter, you knew it was from them." Constance nodded with tears in her eyes, revealing a guilt that she had carried in silence for weeks. "I knew that one day they would come after you. Our lineage has been connected to theirs for generations. Each Davis woman is born with the power to either free them or condemn them definitively. I couldn't let you die for lack of money for my surgery, but I also couldn't condemn you to repeat your grandmother's fate." Her words revealed the impossible dilemma she had faced, choosing between saving her own life and protecting her daughter. "Is he different from the other times, Mom?" asked Amelia, thinking about the intensity of Vincent's gaze, about the way his presence had awakened something dormant in her own soul. "The man I met today. He didn't seem like someone who would harm anyone. He seemed like someone who had been suffering for a very long time. All the men of the Blackwood family are prisoners of the same pact, daughter. They didn't choose this curse, but they are forced to keep it alive to survive. The more time passes, the more human they become, the more capable of true love, but also more dangerous because love is exactly what can break the pact, or destroy everyone involved." Amelia looked out the bedroom window, observing the city lights blinking in the distance like terrestrial stars. In less than a month, she would have to return to Blackwood Manor for the second ritual bath. Now she knew that it wasn't just a well-paid job, but part of a story that had begun decades before her birth, and that could end with her death, or with the liberation of two lineages, trapped in an ancestral dance of desire and curse. The month that separated the first from the second encounter passed like an eternity, compressed into days that dragged with painful slowness. Amelia divided herself between caring for her mother, recovering from the successful surgery, and a growing restlessness that consumed her from within like a constant low fever. Constance's surgery had been a complete success. The doctors optimistic about total recovery. But the financial relief that should have brought inner peace was overshadowed by an anxiety that grew with each day that approached the date marked for her return to the manor. During sleepless nights, Amelia found herself touching her own skin in the places where she had touched Vincent, as if her hands kept the tactile memory of that transformative encounter. The ancestral book of the Davis family remained hidden under her mattress, and she read it secretly during the early hours, discovering disturbing passages about healing rituals that transformed into curses when the heart became involved more than the hands. At the esoteric products shop, she became even more sought after by clients seeking guidance. It was as if the awakening of her ancestral powers had amplified her natural intuition, allowing her to perceive hidden pains, deep fears, and non-verbalized needs of the women who sought her. Her hands, which before only organized crystals and incense, now seemed to emanate their own energy that people felt even without direct contact. One afternoon, 3 days before the date marked for the second encounter, a woman of distinguished appearance entered the shop. She wore expensive but discreet clothes, antique jewelry that suggested family tradition, and her clear eyes studied Amelia with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "You are Amelia Davis," she said without asking a question, but making a statement loaded with meaning. "I needed to meet the young woman who has been visiting Blackwood Manor." The woman introduced herself as Helena Blackwood, Vincent's distant cousin, and the only relative who maintained occasional contact with him. She had come from Boston specifically to meet Amelia, driven by a concern that had grown over the weeks. "Vincent is different," she said, sitting in a chair near the shop counter. For the first time in 20 years he left the property. He was seen walking around the manor during the early hours, as if looking for something, or someone. Helena told details about the curse that Amelia didn't yet know completely. The Blackwood family had made a pact in the 18th century with an entity that promised wealth and longevity in exchange for a specific ritual that should be maintained indefinitely. The men of the lineage were forced to purify themselves monthly through the touch of women of the Davis lineage, descendants of a powerful African healer who had been betrayed and killed by the first Blackwoods in Italy. "The curse functions like a scale," explained Helena with a voice loaded with decades of family knowledge kept in secret. "The more the men of our family purify themselves through the touch of Davis women, the more human they become, the more capable of genuine feelings, but also more vulnerable to true love, which is the only force capable of completely breaking the pact, or destroying everyone involved." Amelia listened in silence, feeling that each word confirmed intuitions she had developed over the month. "And if the pact is broken?" she finally asked. Helena sighed deeply before answering. "If it's broken through true love corresponded, both lovers die but their souls are free to find peace. If it's broken incompletely, through unrequited desire or betrayal, the curse strengthens and spreads through more generations." "Your grandmother tried to break the pact through love," continued Helena. "She and my Uncle Joseph truly fell in love during the bathing rituals. But when they tried to consummate that love, the forces that kept the curse active revolted. She disappeared on a stormy night, and Joseph died 3 days later, leaving Vincent still a child to inherit a pact that became even more powerful after the failed attempt to break it." On the morning of the second encounter, Amelia woke before dawn with her whole body aching, as if she had fought all night. Her dreams had been populated by visions of a woman she recognized as her grandmother, young and beautiful, dancing naked around a bonfire, while a man who resembled Vincent watched her with eyes full of desire and terror. In the dream, her grandmother shouted warnings that she couldn't fully comprehend, but that made her heart race even in the unconscious state. She chose different clothes this time, a dress of finer fabric, wine-colored, that enhanced her brown skin and made her green eyes seem more intense. She couldn't explain rationally the choice, but she felt compelled to present herself differently, as if she instinctively knew that this second encounter would be qualitatively distinct from the first. The journey to New Haven passed in a state of conscious sleepwalking. as if she were being guided by forces greater than her individual will. The bus seemed to float on the road, instead of rolling on the asphalt, and the other passengers seemed like unreal figures, ghosts of a reality she was leaving behind with each mile traveled toward the manor. The gates of Blackwood Manor opened even before she approached, as if her presence was detected from a distance. But this time, it wasn't the elderly man who received her, but Vincent himself, waiting for her on the main driveway with an expression in his dark eyes that mixed anxiety, relief, and something deeper that she couldn't immediately name. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing muscular forearms where she could see some of the smaller scars she had discovered during the first bath. His black hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had repeatedly run his hands through it during hours of nervousness. When their gazes met, both felt the same electric shock that had marked their first encounter. "You came," he said with a hoarse voice, as if he had spent days without speaking to anyone. These were the first words he had addressed to her directly, breaking the rule of silence established in the contract. His voice possessed a very subtle Italian accent, a remnant of the family heritage that time hadn't completely erased. "I couldn't stay away," responded Amelia with an honesty that surprised her. Her own words revealed a truth that she had tried to deny during the entire month. It wasn't just the money that had brought her back, but a deep need to be in his presence again, to touch his skin, to participate in that inexplicable connection that had awakened something dormant in her soul. They walked together toward the house, side by side but without touching, as if they instinctively knew that casual contact would be dangerous outside the controlled environment of the bathing chamber. Vincent led her through a different path this time, crossing the gardens where the black orchids bloomed with an exuberance that she hadn't noticed on the first day. The flowers seemed to pulse with their own life, their velvety petals capturing and reflecting the sunlight in ways that defied the common laws of optics. "They've bloomed more since your last visit," commented Vincent, stopping before a particularly exuberant bed. "It's as if your presence has awakened something in the earth that had been dormant for decades." His observation carried a reverence that made Amelia understand that he was talking about much more than flowers. When they reached the bathing chamber, Amelia noticed that the environment had been prepared differently. More candles, arranged in patterns that resembled esoteric symbols. Water in the bathtub that exhaled an aromatic steam even more intense. Petals of black orchids floating on the surface of the water, like small patches of dark silk. It was evident that he had spent hours preparing that space to receive her. "This time I want to look into your eyes while you touch me," said Vincent, positioning himself before the bathtub, but without entering the water yet. "I can no longer pretend that this is just a ritual without meaning. You have awakened something in me that I thought was dead for decades." His words came loaded with a vulnerability that contrasted with the aura of power that normally emanated from him. Amelia began to undress slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on his during the entire process. This time there was no hesitation or nervousness, but a sensual determination that surprised them both. When she was completely naked, she approached him and began to unbutton his shirt with deliberate movements, her fingers brushing the masculine skin with each button she opened. "I feel it too," she murmured while sliding the shirt over his broad shoulders. "Since I touched you for the first time, it's as if a part of me had been activated, as if I finally understood what I was born for." Her words came loaded with a certainty that transcended rational doubts, a conviction that emerged from deep layers of her ancestral consciousness. When Vincent entered the bathtub this time, the water reacted differently to his presence. Small waves formed without wind, without external movement to justify them, as if the warm liquid recognized that something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of that ancestral ritual. The black orchid petals floating on the surface began to move in circular patterns, drawing spirals that seemed to hypnotize both observers. Amelia approached the bathtub with a natural grace that she herself didn't know she possessed, her movements flowing like an ancestral dance, engraved in her genetic memory. This time, when she immersed her hands in the water to touch his skin, she didn't just feel the electric shock that had marked their first encounter, but a current of energy that ran through her entire body, activating nerve endings she didn't know existed, awakening sensations that transcended the physical. "Tell me about the scars," she asked as her hands slid over his broad shoulders, delicately tracing the marks she had discovered during the first bath. Vincent closed his eyes, not just from pleasure, but from an old pain that finally found someone willing to share the weight of his story. "Each one tells of an attempt to break the pact alone," he murmured with a voice choked by emotion. Her hands continued the exploration, now with a dual purpose, to clean his skin and to know his history through the marks he carried. The scar over his heart, the most prominent, had been a self-inflicted cut at 25 in a desperate attempt to free himself from the curse through proximity to death. "I thought that if I got close enough to death without dying, the pact would lose its power over me," he explained. "I only discovered that I was trapped in ways much deeper than I imagined." Other smaller scars on his arms and wrists told stories of different years, moments of despair when solitude became unbearable, and he sought any way to feel something beyond the emptiness that consumed him. Amelia touched each mark with reverence, as if her hands could heal not just the skin, but the emotional wounds that had motivated each cut, each failed attempt at liberation. "And your family?" "Your parents?" she asked while soaping his chest, feeling under her palms the heart that beat with accelerated rhythm whenever she drew near. Vincent opened his eyes, fixing her with an intensity that carried decades of repressed pain. "My parents died when I was 16, he said. "A car accident on a stormy night, exactly 3 days after my father tried to break the pact by marrying my mother for love." The story unfolded slowly as the bathing ritual continued, her hands working methodically, but with growing tenderness. Joseph Blackwood, Vincent's father, had fallen in love with an ordinary Italian woman, not descended from the Davis lineage. When they tried to consummate the marriage, ignoring the requirements of the ancestral pact, the curse reacted violently. Torrential rains devastated the region for an entire week, culminating in the fateful night when Vincent's parents lost their lives on a road they knew perfectly. "I was left alone at the manor at 16, inheriting not just the properties and businesses, but mainly the responsibility of keeping the pact active to prevent other people from dying because of me," he continued, as she washed his arms with circular movements that seemed to massage not just muscles, but also the emotional tension accumulated over decades of forced isolation. "That's when the monthly rituals began. The first woman who came to bathe me was the same age I am today. She cried throughout the entire process, but fulfilled the ritual. After her, others came, always different, always frightened, always departing without ever looking back. Until you." His voice broke slightly on the last phrase, revealing that Amelia represented something unique in a lifetime of mechanical encounters devoid of true connection. Amelia stopped moving for a moment, her hands resting on his shoulders as she processed the magnitude of the solitude he had faced. 32 years of almost complete isolation, 32 years of monthly rituals with women who feared him or saw him only as a source of easy income, 32 years carrying the weight of deaths that he didn't directly cause, but for which he felt responsible. "You're not to blame for your parents' death," she finally said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "You were just a child who inherited an impossible burden. No teenager should carry the weight of ancestral curses or choices made by previous generations." Her words came imbued with a wisdom that transcended her age, as if channeling the accumulated strength of all the women of the Davis lineage who came before her. Vincent raised one of his wet hands and delicately touched Amelia's face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, with a tenderness that dramatically contrasted with the image of dark power he projected. "You are the first person in decades who looks at me as if I were just a man," he murmured. "Not a symbol, not a walking curse, not a danger to be avoided. Just a man who is tired of being alone." The touch triggered an immediate reaction in the environment around them. The candles illuminating the chamber flickered simultaneously, as if a gust of wind had passed through a completely enclosed space. The water in the bathtub began to visibly heat, steam rising in spirals that formed impossible patterns in the air. The black orchid petals on the water's surface began to glow with a subtle luminescence, as if absorbing and reflecting light that didn't exist. "It's happening again," whispered Vincent, reluctantly removing his hand from her face. "The environment reacts when we touch for real, not just during the ritual. It's the sign that the curse is recognizing a real threat." His voice carried fear not for himself, but for her, for the possibility that her presence in his life could result in the repetition of the tragedy that had cost the lives of his parents and Amelia's grandmother. But Amelia didn't retreat. On the contrary, she leaned in closer, their faces just inches apart, their breaths mingling in the air heavy with steam and energy. "Then let it react," she said with a determination that surprised her. "I won't run from what we're feeling out of fear of a curse that was imposed on us by people we didn't even know. If our ancestors created this problem, perhaps we are exactly the right people to solve it." "You don't understand what you're saying," replied Vincent, but his voice lacked the conviction that his words tried to convey. "If we allow this to evolve beyond the controlled ritual, we could both die. Or worse, you could disappear like your grandmother, trapped between worlds, neither alive nor dead, just lost." Amelia studied the dark eyes that stared at her with a mixture of desire and terror, recognizing in them the reflection of her own contradictory feelings. Part of her knew he was right, that they were playing with ancestral forces they didn't fully understand. But a larger part, more primitive, more connected to the instincts she had inherited from generations of powerful women, whispered that perhaps this was exactly what needed to happen to break a cycle of suffering that had already lasted too long. "Finish the bath," she finally said, but without moving away. "Today we'll fulfill the ritual as it should be fulfilled. But next time—" She left the sentence incomplete, but both understood the implicit promise in her words. Next time, they would consciously explore the limits of what was possible between two people, marked by a destiny they didn't choose, but that perhaps they could rewrite together. Amelia's hands resumed the work of washing his body, but now each touch carried a different intention. It was no longer just the fulfillment of an ancestral ritual, but preparation for a battle that both intuited was approaching. A battle between the love growing between them and the supernatural forces that for centuries had kept their lineages trapped in a dance of desire and destruction. When the bath ended and Vincent stepped out of the bathtub, the water remained warm much longer than it should have. The orchid petals continued to glow softly, and both knew they had crossed an invisible line from which it would not be possible to return. The next encounter would no longer be a purification ritual, but a direct confrontation with a destiny that had been postponed, but never truly avoided. The weeks following the second encounter brought changes that neither Amelia nor Vincent could ignore. For her, the dreams became more vivid and disturbing, populated by visions of a woman she recognized as her grandmother, walking through the corridors of Blackwood Manor, whispering warnings in languages she didn't consciously understand, but that her body received as ancestral truths engraved in her DNA. During the day, her sensitivity to the energies around her intensified dramatically. At the esoteric products shop, she could feel the physical and emotional pains of clients before they even verbalized their problems. Her hands seemed to emanate their own heat, and several women commented that they felt better just from being briefly touched by her during service. "You have the gift," said Mrs. Francis, the elderly owner of the shop, observing Amelia with growing curiosity. "Your hands carry something that can't be learned, only inherited." More disturbing still were the moments when she caught herself looking in the mirror and glimpsing, for split seconds, not her own reflection, but the face of an older woman with her green eyes, wearing period clothes and an expression of desperate urgency. Whenever she tried to focus on the vision, it disappeared, leaving only her familiar image and a sensation of incompleteness that accompanied her for the rest of the day. At Blackwood Manor, the changes in Vincent were equally dramatic, but manifested in different ways. For the first time in 20 years, he began to leave the property limits during the early hours, walking the rural roads that surrounded the manor, as if searching for something he couldn't name. Mr. Joaquin, the loyal caretaker, found him one morning sitting at the property gate, observing the road that led to the city, with an expression of longing he had never seen in his employer. The black orchids in the gardens bloomed with an exuberance that defied the seasons and climatic conditions. Flowers that normally lasted weeks remained vigorous for more than a month, and new varieties began to sprout spontaneously, as if the earth was responding to energies that had remained dormant for decades. Mrs. Geraldine, the cook, commented that she had never seen the master eat with such appetite or sleep so little without seeming exhausted. But it was the letters that completely changed the course of events. Vincent began writing to Amelia long, handwritten letters that he burned before sending, until one night of insomnia he decided to preserve one. The letter arrived at Amelia's house on a rainy Monday, delivered by a young motorcyclist who disappeared before she could ask any questions. The handwriting was the same as the original proposal, but the words carried an intimacy that made her blush as she read. Vincent described the dreams he had been having about her, dreams where they walked together through the manor gardens, under a golden light that didn't come from the sun, where their hands intertwined without the touch causing supernatural reactions, where they conversed for hours about books, music, philosophy, like normal people who had known each other for years. "My dear Amelia," the letter began, "I can no longer pretend that you are just another woman fulfilling a contract. You have awakened in me not just physical sensations, but the capacity to dream of a different future, something I hadn't allowed myself for more than 3 decades. I know we are walking towards something dangerous, but for the first time in my life, the danger seems preferable to the safety of an empty existence." The letter continued for 3 pages, revealing aspects of his personality that the bathing rituals had only hinted at. He spoke about books he read during the long sleepless nights, about classical music he listened to while tending the orchids, about the solitude that had become so familiar that he had begun to confuse it with company. But mainly, he talked about how her presence had illuminated corners of his soul that he believed permanently submerged in darkness. Amelia responded the same night, using perfumed paper she found in an old drawer of her mother's, writing with a fountain pen that had belonged to her disappeared grandmother. Her words flowed naturally, as if she were writing to someone she had intimately known for years. She told about the disturbing dreams, about the changes she felt in her own body and mind, about the fear and excitement of approaching something that could completely transform her life. "Dear Vincent," she wrote, "you ask me if I'm afraid of what might happen between us. I am, but I'm also afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering, what if? My grandmother tried to break the curse through love and disappeared. But perhaps she tried in the wrong way or at the wrong time or with the wrong person. Perhaps we are the right combination of right people at the right time." The exchange of letters intensified over the weeks, with Vincent sending messages almost daily through the same mysterious young motorcyclist who never stayed long enough to be questioned. The letters evolved from cautious confessions to passionate declarations, both exploring through words an intimacy they couldn't yet physically explore without risks. It was in a particularly long letter that Vincent revealed a disturbing discovery. While researching in the ancestral archives of the family, he had found documents suggesting that the curse wasn't random, but followed a specific pattern. Approximately every 100 years, a woman of the Davis lineage appeared, who possessed the power not just to keep the pact active, but to break it definitively. "Your grandmother, Mary, was that woman 100 years ago," wrote Vincent. "She had the power to free us, but the timing wasn't right. The stars, the phases of the moon, the natural cycles that govern ancestral magic weren't aligned in the necessary way. But now, according to the calculations I found in the family grimoires, we are approaching another moment of perfect alignment." The revelation left Amelia simultaneously hopeful and terrified. It meant that her connection with Vincent wasn't just mutual attraction or romantic destiny, but part of a cosmic cycle that had been interrupted 100 years ago and now sought to complete itself. It also meant that they had a limited window of time to try to break the curse, and if they failed, they would condemn not just themselves, but the next generations of both lineages. 3 days before the third scheduled encounter, Amelia had the most vivid dream yet. Her grandmother appeared not as a shadow or glimpse, but clearly as if she were alive, sitting on the edge of her bed in the middle of the night. "Time is running out, girl," said Mary with a voice that mixed urgency and tenderness. "What I couldn't complete, you can, but you need to be brave in ways I wasn't. You need to trust in love in ways I couldn't." The grandmother extended one of her hands, revealing a scar on her palm that formed the perfect design of an orchid. "This mark appeared when I touched Joseph for the first time with the intention of loving him, not just healing him. It's the sign that the pact recognized a real threat. When you touch Vincent with true love, the mark will appear in your hand as well. And then you'll have only 3 days to complete the breaking of the curse, or you'll both die. Amelia woke with her right hand burning, as if it had been marked with a hot iron. When she turned on the light, she saw with horror and fascination that a thin scar was forming on her palm, still fresh, still painful, but already clearly recognizable as the design of an orchid. The mark that her grandmother had shown in the dream was materializing on her own skin, an unmistakable sign that events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. That morning, she received the last letter from Vincent before the third encounter. Just one line, written with handwriting that betrayed hands trembling with emotion. "I have the mark too. See you tomorrow for better or worse." Amelia knew at that moment that the third ritual bath would not be like the previous ones. It would be the beginning of the end of a story that had begun 100 years earlier with her grandmother, or it would be the true beginning of a life that both only dared to dream. The choice would be theirs, but the consequences would transcend their individual lives, echoing through past and future generations of two lineages trapped in an ancestral dance of love and curse. The countdown had begun, and both knew that after the next encounter, there would be no turning back. It would be liberation or destruction, full life or premature death, but never again the half-tone existence that both had known until then. Fate had played its final card, and now it was up to them to decide how they would play their own cards in this cosmic game that would define not just their futures, but the liberation of a past that for generations had haunted two families. The morning of the third encounter dawned laden with omens that neither Amelia nor Vincent could ignore. The sky over Virginia was an unusual ashen color, neither rain clouds nor clear sky, but something in between that seemed suspended in the air like an interrupted breath. Amelia woke with the orchid scar on her palm pulsing like a secondary heart, each beat synchronized with something larger than her own blood circulation. At Blackwood Manor, Vincent spent the previous night walking through the gardens in a state of feverish vigil, observing how the black orchids behaved strangely. Some flowers that had bloomed weeks before now glowed with their own luminescence that dispensed with sunlight, while others closed and opened in rhythms that seemed to accompany his breathing. The soil around the beds was darker than normal, almost black, as if absorbing light instead of reflecting it. When Amelia arrived at the manor, she found the gates open, but no sign of the caretaker or the cook. The property seemed deserted, enveloped in a silence that went beyond the absence of people, a silence that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the ancestral buildings. Vincent awaited her at the main entrance of the house, dressed entirely in white, as if he were simultaneously bridegroom and sacrifice in a ritual that transcended human understanding. "They left," he said when she approached, referring to the staff. "Mrs. Geraldine woke this morning, saying her dreams warned her not to remain at the manor today. Mr. Joaquin said the same thing. Simple people sometimes perceive changes in energies before we, who try to rationalize everything, can accept them." His voice carried a serenity that contrasted with the visible tension in his body. Amelia showed him her palm, where the orchid scar was now completely formed, an intricate mark that seemed to have been tattooed by a divine artist. Vincent extended his own hand, revealing an identical mark but slightly larger, with additional details that suggested his connection to the ancestral pact was deeper than hers. When their marked palms touched, an electric current ran through both bodies, but this time accompanied by a sensation of completeness that transcended physical pleasure. "Today won't be like the other days," said Amelia, her voice carrying a determination that had grown during the weeks of correspondence and disturbing dreams. "Today we will consciously choose to break this curse, even knowing we might die in the process. I can no longer live pretending we're just two people fulfilling a ritual. I love you, Vincent, and I know you love me too." The words left her lips with surprising naturalness, as if she had practiced that declaration for years. Vincent closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing deeply, before opening them again with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously protected and vulnerable. "I've loved you since the moment you entered that chamber the first time," he responded. "But love isn't enough to break a blood pact. We need complete surrender, body and soul, knowing it's likely we'll die in the process." They walked together toward the bathing chamber, but this time, The environment was transformed in ways that defied rational explanation. The candles had lit themselves and burned with blue flames that didn't generate heat, but emanated a cold light that made the marble walls shine as if made of black diamond. The bathtub was filled with water that seemed to have a different density than normal, thicker, more viscous, reflecting their images like a perfect liquid mirror. Black orchid petals not only floated on the water's surface, but seemed to swim in complex patterns that formed ancestral symbols, mandalas that continually dissolved and reformed. The air was charged with an electricity that made their hair stand on end, even without wind, and both could hear whispers in the walls, voices of past generations that seemed to comment on what was about to happen. Amelia began to undress slowly, but this time Vincent didn't avert his gaze. On the contrary, he observed each movement with religious reverence, as if witnessing the materialization of a deity. When she was completely naked, she approached him and began to unbutton his white shirt, her fingers trembling not from nervousness, but from the anticipation of energies she knew she was about to unleash. "If we're going to do this, let's do it completely," she murmured while sliding the shirt off his shoulders, without fear, without reservations, without trying to control what will happen. Her hands explored his bare chest, tracing the scars she knew, but now with a different intention. It was no longer a cleansing ritual, but preparation for complete surrender. When they both entered the bathtub together, the water reacted instantly. The liquid began to bubble without an external heat source. Small waves formed, creating turbulences that seemed to come from beneath the surface. The black orchid petals began to spin in increasingly faster spirals, creating small whirlpools that pulled and pushed their bodies against each other. For the first time in 3 months of rituals, Vincent deliberately touched Amelia, his large hands enveloping her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the intensity of the moment. "If I kiss you now, there's no going back," he whispered with his lips inches from hers. "The forces that maintain the pact will react violently. The house might collapse, the earth might open up. We might be separated forever or united in death." "Then kiss me," she responded without hesitation, "and let's discover together what our fate will be." Her words came charged with a courage that transcended rational fear, a determination that came from deep layers of her soul where ancestral memories resided of women who faced the impossible for love. The kiss that followed was simultaneously a first kiss and a reunion of souls that had known each other for centuries. Lips met with desperate hunger, tongues explored with the urgency of those who know time is limited, bodies pressed against each other with a need that transcended physical desire. It was complete surrender, mutual recognition, acceptance of a destiny that both had consciously chosen. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The water in the bathtub began to literally boil, steam rising in thick columns that formed ghostly figures in the air. The marble walls began to tremble, small cracks forming and spreading like spider webs. The candles extinguished simultaneously, but the chamber remained illuminated by a golden light that emanated from their intertwined bodies themselves. Amelia felt as if she were being pulled by opposing forces, part of her consciousness being dragged away, while another part merged completely with Vincent. She could see through vision that didn't come from her physical eyes. Generations of Davis women and Blackwood men, all connected in a cosmic web of love and curse that extended across the centuries. "I might lose you," whispered Vincent against her lips, feeling that she was becoming less solid in his arms, as if slowly dissolving in the water that surrounded them. "You're disappearing like your grandmother disappeared." His voice carried desperation that went beyond the possibility of death, but of the prospect of solitary eternity. "Don't let me go," begged Amelia, fighting against the sensation of being pulled into a parallel dimension where she could see her grandmother, extending her hands, calling her to join her in the limbo between worlds where she had been trapped for decades. "If you hold me, if you don't let me depart, perhaps we can break the cycle differently than she tried." Vincent embraced her with desperate force, their naked bodies intertwined in the water that now seemed to have a life of its own, trying to separate them while they struggled to remain united. The chamber around them began to spin as if they were at the center of a hurricane, objects flying, marble cracking, the sound of generations of voices shouting simultaneously filling the air. At the center of the supernatural chaos, both understood that they had initiated an irreversible process, There was no longer any possibility of pretending. They were just two people fulfilling a work contract. They were now two souls facing an ancestral destiny, willing to die together if they couldn't live together, determined to break a curse that had consumed entire generations of their families. The orchid mark on their palms began to glow with its own light, and both instinctively knew they had only hours, perhaps minutes, to discover how to complete what they had begun. Love had been declared, surrender had been made, but there was still a missing element, a final piece of the puzzle they needed to find before the ancestral forces separated them definitively or destroyed them completely. At the exact moment when Amelia began to dissolve in Vincent's arms, when her physical form began to become translucent like vapor, she heard her grandmother's voice not as a distant whisper, but as a shout of urgency that cut through the supernatural chaos devastating the bathing chamber. "The blood, child! Mix the blood from the marks. That's what I couldn't do in time." With sudden clarity that transcended the panic of the moment, Amelia understood what had been missing in her grandmother's attempt 100 years before. Love wasn't enough. Physical surrender wasn't enough. Not even the willingness to die together was enough. The ancestral pact had been sealed with blood, and blood would be necessary to break it definitively. But not just any blood, but the blood from the orchid marks that now shone in their palms like burning stars. "Vincent!" she shouted through the roar of supernatural forces that made the house tremble to its foundations. "We need to cut the marks. Mix our blood in the water." Her voice fought against the sound of generations of ancestral voices echoing through the cracked walls, some beseeching blessings, others proclaiming curses, all witnessing the crucial moment that would define the destiny of two lineages. Vincent didn't hesitate. With the desperate strength of a man fighting for the life of the woman he loved, he pulled Amelia back to physical solidity, his arms enveloping her like an anchor that prevented her from completely disappearing. With his free hand, he took a sharp fragment of marble that had detached from the wall during the tremors and, without hesitation, cut the orchid mark on his own palm. The blood that flowed wasn't ordinary red, but golden like ancient honey, flowing from the wound in patterns that seemed to draw symbols in the air, before falling into the boiling water of the bathtub. The sacred liquid spread across the surface in spirals that formed complex mandalas, each drop creating concentric waves that seemed to carry their own power. Amelia took the same marble fragment and cut her own mark, feeling pain that transcended the physical and reached ancestral layers of her soul. Her blood also flowed golden, mingling with his in the water that now seemed made of precious liquid metal. The moment the two bloodstreams touched completely, the chaos around them instantly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire universe had paused to witness what was happening. The water in the bathtub became a perfect mirror, reflecting not their current faces, but the faces of all the ancestors of both lineages who had participated in the original curse. Hundreds of faces floated on the liquid surface, Blackwood men and Davis women from different eras, all watching with expressions that mixed hope and terror. "It's working," whispered Vincent, feeling as if decades of weight were being removed from his shoulders. The sensation of imprisonment that had accompanied him since adolescence began to dissolve, replaced by a lightness he had forgotten was possible. "I can feel the pact unraveling, like chains breaking." Amelia saw with supernatural clarity the energetic connections that had linked their lineages for centuries, golden threads that pulsed between past and present, between life and death, between curse and liberation. These threads began to dissolve one by one, each break accompanied by a collective sigh of souls that finally found peace. In the center of the bathtub, the mixture of their golden blood began to form a new image, a black orchid that slowly changed color, dark petals giving way to shades of purple, then pink finally blooming in pure white. It was the symbol of complete transformation, of curse converted to blessing, of love that had conquered ancestral forces that seemed invincible. "Your grandmother is here," said Amelia, clearly seeing the figure of Mary materialized beside the bathtub, no longer as a tormented ghost, but as a serene presence that radiated gratitude. "She's smiling. She's free." The grandmother waved one last time before dissolving into particles of golden light that were absorbed by the chamber walls, healing the cracks, restoring the marble to its original perfection. Joseph Blackwood, Vincent's father, materialized on the other side of the bathtub, his appearance young as in the painting in the main hall. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of approval and forgiveness that Vincent had longed to receive for 3 decades. "You achieved what I couldn't, son. You broke the cycle. Now live the life that all of us dreamed of having." The water in the bathtub began to gradually cool, returning to normality, the black orchid petals transforming into white petals that floated gently on the surface. The marble chamber remained intact but transformed, the walls now emanating welcoming warmth instead of the ancestral coldness that had characterized them for centuries. When they finally exited the bathtub, Amelia and Vincent discovered that their palms had completely healed, but the orchid marks remained, now no longer as symbols of curse, but as sacred tattoos that celebrated their victory over forces that had seemed invincible. The marks glowed softly whenever their hands touched, a permanent reminder of the love that had proven more powerful than centuries of darkness. In the days that followed, the changes at Blackwood Manor were visible to any observer. The gardens exploded in colors that hadn't been seen for decades, not just orchids but roses, jasmine, violets, as if the earth finally had permission to sustain abundant life. The house lost its somber atmosphere, becoming welcoming, inviting, a true home for the first time in generations. Vincent discovered he could leave the property without feeling the claustrophobic anxiety that had imprisoned him for 3 decades. He traveled with Amelia to Richmond, met her recovered mother, walked the streets of the capital as a free man, no longer a prisoner of a destiny he hadn't chosen. The wealth accumulated by generations of Blackwoods could finally be used for good, not just to maintain ancestral rituals. Amelia discovered that her healing powers had amplified instead of disappearing with the breaking of the curse. Her hands now carried a genuine capacity to heal physical and emotional pains, a gift she used to open a holistic clinic at the manor, serving people from throughout the region who sought alternative forms of treatment. They married in a simple ceremony in the manor gardens, surrounded only by Constance, by the loyal staff, and by some of the women Amelia had helped in her new clinic. There were no illustrious guests or extravagant celebration, but there was something much more precious, the invisible but palpable presence of generations of ancestors who could finally rest in peace. During the ceremony, conducted by a priest from the neighboring town, who asked no questions about the strange stories surrounding the property, white orchid petals fell from the sky in a gentle rain that lasted exactly the duration of the exchange of vows. It was an ancestral blessing, confirmation that 2 lineages marked by centuries of suffering had finally found peace through love that had transcended death and curse. Months later, when Amelia discovered she was pregnant, both knew that the child would be the first of their lineages to be born completely free, without the weight of ancestral pacts or supernatural obligations. It would be a new generation, raised with love, protected by parents who had proven that even cosmic forces can be defeated when 2 souls unite with true purpose. On a golden autumn afternoon, as they walked through the flourishing gardens of the manor, watching Constance teach her first words to their 6-month-old daughter, Amelia and Vincent stopped before the bed where the original black orchids had grown. Now, the space was occupied by white orchids of rare beauty, flowers that symbolized transformation, rebirth, love that had conquered ancestral darkness. "Do you regret it?" asked Vincent, intertwining his fingers with hers, the marks on their palms glowing softly at the contact. "Risking everything for someone you barely knew?" Amelia smiled, watching their daughter play with fallen petals, while Constance supervised with the tenderness of a dedicated grandmother. "I only regret not having met you sooner," she responded. "Our story began with a curse but ended with a blessing. How many people can say that their love was strong enough to change destinies that seemed immutable?" As evening fell, when the first stars began to appear in the Virginia sky, Blackwood Manor breathed a peace it hadn't known for centuries. 2 lineages had been liberated, an impossible love had become reality, and a new generation would grow with